I hope you had a good lunch and feel refreshed. Just to introduce my panel properly, I don't think Nigel needs introduction given his role here. We do then have Tim Oldman, who's Chief Executive of Leesman, Gillian, who's a Director of Michael Laird and BCO Chair in Scotland, who you met this morning, and Bridget Workman, who's a Director of the Changing Work Company. Now, we're on a tight time schedule, as Jeremy said, but I do want to just for one moment take you back to a point in time. See if you can guess where this was. We had high energy costs, inflation was running away, we had a global war by proxy, and we had political upheaval, and not least, we had a plethora of management books telling us about the future of work. Any guesses? Well, it was the early 90s. 91, 92, 93, that sort of period. And I say that because that was the point at which we as an industry became obsessed with densities. We had a massive mother and father of recessions, and suddenly the focus was on reducing space footprints, as it's called now. And the search for efficiency and space use became a single objective in its own right, which is very good. In measuring and reporting are good things in corporate life, as we all know. But the problem is that they do become slightly obsessive at times. And to some extent, that's what's happened with density. And the key problem here is that the evidence itself has become a single target. So we all work to a single number now, rather than understanding what densities mean in a more subtle set of ways. Of course, then later on, in the 1990s, we had the introduction of agile working, where we had the terrible twins then of not just efficiency, but also productivity. We're trying to measure space use and utilisation at the same time, often, let's say, struggling and confusing the two together. Moving on again, we now have COVID, post-COVID hopefully, with again a whole raft of new approaches to the workplace. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does densities mean in this new world that we're moving into? And I'm going to ask a few questions of our panel in a moment, but just to pose a few issues here. We've got a discussion around base build versus Cat B. We all know what that means in terms of providing escape routes and sanitation in buildings and the fit out itself. Then there's the question about desks versus people. And then we have the question about, with agility, about buildings versus floors and areas and teams versus company. And now the whole issue of Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays and demand management. So density, while it's been around for a long time, it's morphed in many ways, and the discussion's moving on. And we have to ask some fairly fundamental questions now about what it all means. I'm hoping over the next 30 minutes we'll answer those questions, team. So I'd just like to pose a fairly sort of all-encompassing question to start with of the panel. And in this post-COVID world of agile and hybrid working, is occupancy density itself relevant? And apart from the base build issues that I mentioned, perhaps, how useful is it as a benchmark? And what does it actually tell us about the use of buildings now? Nigel.
It is and it isn't. That sounds a bit of a cop-out. But I think we all need a target. Certainly the research I've just completed on behalf of BCO, when we were interviewing people and also when we were surveying people, and they were like, well, you know, it's so difficult these days. Is it about the number of people in the building at any one time? Is it about the head count? And it's very complicated, and there's differences across sectors, although we didn't find any, and different floor densities and so on. So it's a bit more complicated. You know, it'd be wrong just to have a single number, density number. What we need is a set of guidelines about how we determine the right number. But a number's useful, isn't it? Can we have a number as well? And so we're kind of calling it a bit of a rule of thumb. So anyone who's read the report will know that we went for the 8 to 10 square meters, just because in the research we found that when you start going below 8, then issues start to happen in terms of noise, performance, other factors. So yeah, I think we need a kind of marker in the sand, but I don't think that's the right answer.
Coming this way, Tim.
For fear of us all vehemently agreeing with each other, I would question whether we're chasing the right target, because I think there's a risk in the number that we published, and we were a collaborator in Nigel's report, is the same number that was existing before the report for most generic projects. So it's like, well, if nothing changes, then why don't you actually question whether the goal that you're aiming at is the right goal? So, okay, with a little bit of vested interest for those of you who know what I do, But why don't we measure the experience quality that the employee has in the place of work? Yeah. Because we know that that directly links to their output. And if we are trying to measure not productivity, but output, then surely that's the goal that everybody should be chasing, not obsessing over whether it's 1 person per 8 or 1 person per 20, which was the range that we saw in the study, the data points that we contributed to Nigel. But actually, what happens to the employee in the day that they choose to be there? Because the last thing in the tail is that in all the measurements we've been doing during the pandemic, over 400,000 employees have told us about their experience of working from home. The average home supports the average employee better than the average office. Now that's using our measurement standard, and the clients who come and work with us are interested in employee experience. They spend money with consultants like you lot, right? So they're not exactly the average client in the first place. But if they're below average, the employee is better at home, then we've got to also accept that the history is not that good. The product pre-pandemic wasn't entirely fit for purpose. So that's why I think some new targets and new goals would be a better conversation to be had.
Thank you. Gillian?
I think, do we need guidance? I think we do. But I think how we're actually measuring that is important. So part of the BCO guidance talks about expected utilisation in the space. So I think we all need to be clear. So our members are saying, what does this mean? So the BCO need to be able to articulate that. And I think the report actually does it quite well. But I also agree with you, because we did a multi-client study for NatWest, actually, and we asked them this question, not this exact question, but how important is density now? And one guy from one of the big 4 accountants said, not at all. Employee value proposition is what we need to focus on, because I suppose the kind of egalitarian nature of how they could recruit meant that they could recruit somebody from Newcastle rather than London. So because predominantly that person would be working from home, maybe come to a key office once every 2 weeks. So, and their recruits were demanding and expecting that level of agility and hybrid nature of work.
But that almost undermines that idea that they're only getting value in 2 days a month.
Yeah.
What value proposition is the office to that organisation if a critical employee only gets value 2 days, more so than they get in their own home? I don't see that as a sustainable future for offices.
Yeah, that was his point. Do we need offices in the future?
No, I don't think you do.
Depends. I think it depends what you do.
You don't need bad offices. You need amazing offices that people want to come to more than 2 days a week.
That's fine. Bridget?
Yeah, I think density is still relevant, and I think it is still useful to have some benchmarks, but I tend to agree with Nigel that the simplistic benchmarks that we used to use were very good at the time, but I think we've had to move on from that, because the underpinning assumptions behind those benchmarks are no longer stand, in particular for normal office use. What we used to think of as normal office use is no longer like that. So we have to modify that with understanding of utilisation and occupancy. So I think the sort of benchmarks now would be more around effective space per person rather than some overall figure. And I think it's really important to understand what is appropriate for different types of work, because different densities will be, or different utilisation densities will be useful for different types of work. And if you can understand that better, then you can actually aim for that in a more deliberate way. I do think it's useful to have some benchmarks, because it guides the decision-making process up front, and it guides people having confidence that they are in the right ballpark or making the right kind of decision or strategy. The refinement then comes down to people's experience, you know, and how you would have the flexibility to adjust your interior space and how it's used is, I think, something that then requires a play between the organisation and its people on how those are used.
I mean, we did do that in the report, of course, and sorry to anyone who's not ready, but we did start with that number, and then there was like loads of offshoots and questions which kind of came to another number. So like you're saying, you need a starting point, but don't just do the lazy thing and read that one number and assume that is it for everyone.
No, the purpose of the report that Nigel's alluding to for the BCO is about informing the base build specification. So it's about sanitation, it's about airflow, it's about escape routes. but it's taken then into the Cat B discussion.
Yes.
And that's probably where the thing breaks down a little bit. I'm conscious of time, and Tim, maybe this is one that you can kick off with, given your background, as it were. Just to explore the point at which density has a positive and or negative effect on both efficiency, but also on effectiveness or output, I think as you call it preferably.
Yeah, and I think the studies are in Nigel's report, but if you look at the whole world and you look at the densities that are deployed in different parts of the world based on the economic pressures in certain cities and certain geographies, there is nothing that we could pinpoint that says there is a sweet spot for occupant density planning. So that's the first thing. We can't give a number of which plus or minus you're going to start to see variation in output. And to Bridget's point, the first thing you have to do is understand what the occupiers, the employees are expecting to be doing in that place. You have to design the infrastructure around the organisational need, and the organisational need comes down to the employee need. So let the employee be the epicenter of the work out, rather than any single number being the target. And maybe it's pulling slightly back to the last comments, but maybe what's happened is that a guideline number for sort of conceptual best practice has somehow been allowed to elevate itself to a target or a goal.
Yeah, exactly.
If you look at the work that Nigel did with Paige on acoustics in workplace, there would have been diagnostic numbers that you would look for to understand whether the comfort levels with noise were good or bad. But we don't seem to do that with occupant density. We don't see whether the experience is poor or it's great, and then look and see what occupant density were they planned at. It's almost like you set off with the occupant density as one of the first measures and metrics. It should be the other way around, that actually it's an outcome rather than a driver. So.
Other comments on negative and pluses?
I think there are occasions when quite a high density of people in an environment is actually a positive because of what they're trying to do. And here we have a high density of people in an environment, but it's actually appropriate because of what we're doing in this conference. It wouldn't be appropriate if you were all having to, trying to have conversations on Zoom calls or something like that. So that understanding of what the need is, I think, is absolutely critical to designing appropriate occupant densities for the task. I mean, the really tricky thing is going to be actually how you achieve that. Mm-hmm. Because how would one attract the right number of people into that space, or not too many? And how do you marry that with this base build sort of maximum people that the building itself can accommodate? And you wouldn't want to go over that frequently or ever. So that's the really tricky thing is managing, I think, this utilisation part rather than, perhaps we can approach some sort of good benchmarks on ideal densities for different types of tasks, but I still think it's a really tricky thing in the future to actually get the people there.
But even then, in terms of granularity, we were talking on the prep call about a contact centre. Yeah. An inbound contact centre has a different vibe requirement to an outbound contact centre. An outbound contact centre has a different vibe to an emergency services inbound call centre. So, I think it's a hard ask for any professional association to be asked to publish a table of figures that provide an incoming occupier with a number on which to base a business case. That's not fair, I don't think, on the industry to be expected to do that. The industry needs to be allowed to be better at understanding the need of the employee and therefore the need of the organisation. Gillian,
thoughts on efficiency?
Violently agreeing with you all, to be perfectly honest. I mean, for us, the key change is the way the net usable area has changed and what that landscape looks like now. So if we saw it earlier in a number of virtually all of the discussions this morning. It's about getting that balance and choice that gives staff the opportunity to actually choose where they work. But again, if it's briefing, it's understanding what your client needs and being able to reflect that and having a target. But as long as there's a narrative around the decision making for your design solution, then it's still valid.
Which is called designing for activity-based working, wasn't it?
But also to pick up on Bridget's point about within a building, you might have a restaurant, you might have an auditorium. They're not all just bog standard office floors, and there'll be trading floors and call centres and all the rest of it. So even that adds to the complexity. How so, for example, I've been caught out a couple of times where we've moved a higher education institution into a speculative building, but of course then you end up with auditoriums like this, and the spec hasn't allowed for that.
Right.
So then we're plugging in lots more AC, unless we can move it around the building at different times. But when you've generally got auditoriums on each floor, classrooms on each floor, then we're having to add a load more plant.
Mm-hmm. I remember when the big law firms and accountants were moving to new environments for working, and they're doing that. They're having a client, socialising floors. Then the worker bee floors, they were called. But of course, the building system's a single system, so it caters for both for the same solution, if you like. So yeah, that needs sorting out the base build. Again, that's something that can be taken back to the base build discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, and in the opposite argument, you obviously don't design for auditoriums on every floor if you're going to be working at lower densities for typical workspaces.
The challenge, I think, in doing that for engineers is trying to build out a case for a developer that says, on a Thursday afternoon, like we're working with Cisco as an example, they're developing these immersion centres. Now, when they fully ram an immersion centre in one of their floors in Manhattan, that central plant has got to work an awful lot harder than it has 6 other days of the week. But that might never happen again for another month.
Yeah.
And I think if you're being asked to engineer solutions with that level of elasticity, I don't think many of the existing sort of financial plans that we hear about can take that into account. Now, maybe there's a future for intelligent buildings, sensor-based technologies in order to be able to reallocate central plant, but I think that then requires the developer to consider their core obligations in a different way to what the tenant picks up as their own obligation when they occupy.
Yeah, and certainly back to your, it's about the user experience, but you can use some sensors to help with that, like CO2 sensors and so on, rather than assume it's a fixed ventilation rate.
And we're in an age now where buildings are becoming more permeable, aren't they, for multiple users and even public access now. So the building systems themselves are going to have to cater for that changing profile of demand. Which brings us on to the third question, really, which is sort of the proverbial elephant in the room, which is about Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. I hate acronyms. And how we manage demand through the week in this post-COVID world. It's utterly unsustainable that we have buildings empty Friday through Tuesday. That's just a non-starter as far as anybody's concerned, I think. But how do we begin to think about this notion of managed demand over this midweek hump?
Very tricky.
Bridget?
Well, I think it's very, very difficult because the mantra, the acknowledgement is that we want to give people choice, and that choice improves the employee's experience and the way they do their work. On the other hand, if everybody chooses these 3 days, then you have this problem with the building. So unless you can actually find a way to use the building for different uses on the other days, which I suppose which could be one alternative, that you acknowledge that those days of the week are the maximum utilisation, and then you've got something else going on with peripheral, small-scale use. Or you have to start managing occupancy, utilisation in a way that impinges on people's freedom of choice. And if that's the route to take, then I think that has to be done very sensitively because people, I think, are no longer very happy about being told what to do, where to be at any particular time, and they know that they can work very well at home a lot of the time. And so it's about emphasising the value of the coming together is what we're talking about on the Monday, Friday, and whether it's an argument around making good use of the space through the week from a sustainability point of view, or having a time in the building when it's less busy and therefore you can get the facilities you want, the meeting rooms you want on those days. So, or specific incentives to draw people in, rather than wagging the finger and telling people what they need to do. But it is a very, very tricky management question.
I mean, I totally agree. We tend to think about attracting people back to the office through the physical design, but it's also, like you say, about what's going on, what are the events, what's the use. And a story I quite often tell is about when I had my team of 12 workplace consultants. our team meetings were on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. So we'd all have our meeting, which meant we could talk about what we'd done during the week. We got ourselves ready for the Monday, and so we got our ducks in a row for the Monday. And then we all went to the pub and had a social, which was very good for a young team, and it gave them purpose for coming in on Friday. And we could always get a meeting room as well, because no one else was around.
So for all the young managers in the room, that's what happens to you if that's how you progress your management career. Like the numbers are pretty horrible, right, to contend with in terms of the maths. So 83% of employees that we surveyed in the last quarter are now working in a hybrid way, which includes their home. So that's flattening out that number. So you're going to be, in most knowledge-based organisations, looking at a number of around about 80% of employees. Rough numbers, a third of employees want to be office-based or need to be office-based for 3 days or more a week. A third at 2 days a week, and a third at 1 day or less. And there's a tiny proportion at the far end of the 1 day or less that I'd shout out for as well, which is 7% of employees have no fixed routine that they can give a facility manager or their manager to tell them when they need the workplace. So the ups and downs are quite, the tide mark rising and lowering is significant. So I think most organizations accept that at some stage they're going to have to help employees make the right decision on how to optimize the experience. Because the other stat is that numbers vary between 20 and 25% in most organizations of employees who do not have a place at home that properly supports them working remotely. So if you've got that contingent needing the office 3+ days a week, and they have a rubbish experience on a Monday and a Friday because nobody's there, they have a rubbish experience on a Wednesday because everybody's there, and they're only there for 2 days a week and they have an optimal experience, then guess what? Their outputs descend as well. So there's all sorts of stuff happening in the detailed numbers that managers need to contend with. And I think this goes to executive level because it is about a freedom was granted, trust was granted, you can't withdraw it. But you have to appeal, I think, to employees to acknowledge that we're in this together, and maybe in a perverse way the economic landscape that we're approaching would help that conversation, because we're going to have to look for a sort of a collective effort to solve the problem.
You say a freedom was granted, but it wasn't granted, was it?
Trust was handed over.
We all had to go home for a health scare.
Yeah, but Rob, let's not go. Like, there were people who weren't allowed to take their mobile phone to their desk, who had to leave it in a locker, and a week later they were given a laptop and trusted to work at home on the same network that their kids were playing online with.
Don't dispute that. Yeah. I'm saying it wasn't given as a choice. It was we all had to be working at home. And the question is, it's because there's another question to this, which is, given that we can't have offices empty 2 days a week, or in fact 4 days a week, is the issue of mandate going to come back?
Well, don't build offices. Especially offices that don't support the employee being a better employee than they can be at home. Our problem is not a supply problem, it's an oversupply problem. So I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. How can we repurpose swathes of office stock? Because the other thing we've got is a rush to high quality. Because if you know that the higher the quality of the environment you can offer, the more likelihood the employee coming back of their own free will, then any client who's got a lease event coming up is going to look to the better quality stock. So you're going to get the retarded stock flooding the market with no potential future use.
But if you say have less offices, which I completely agree with, you've still got the midweek hump. You've still got Mondays and Fridays vacant. So that's no more sustainable at that level than at a higher level.
As I said, I don't have there is no silver bullet to this. But my sense is that most mature organizations will engage in a sort of co-creation, co-design with their employees that says, we're in this together, we're your employer. If you want to stay with that equilibrium and the organizational success, us all sharing a common purpose, then we're going to have to address this problem together, which means that there has to be some degree of, whether it's self-governance or load balancing, this idea of, you've got to be more conscious about your return to office. So you're going to book 2 weeks in advance, or you're going to book 3 weeks in advance. You would if you were flying.
Okay. Gillian, anything to...
I think what I'd written down here was, it's about engaging with your people. You're dead right. I mean, we do a lot of work for BT, and they totally nailed down their customer contact centre, and they were all sent to work from home. A month later, I interviewed some staff that worked in Glasgow, and they were just delighted that they'd had that opportunity, and they proved that they could be trusted, and they felt empowered. They set up Teams groups to chat to each other. It's been a huge success. But on the back of that success, they do need to come back into the office at some point because they need to share between teams and each other and actually remember that they're part of a bigger organisation and a bigger team. So essentially that, that you've already engaged with them and you've trusted them. So take them on the journey and say, we haven't got an infinite building that supports everyone. So it is about communicating with your team and the building facilities manager about when you're coming in and what you need when you're coming in. And you will be expected and it will be ready, but you need to follow, that you need to adapt your behaviours, to think beyond yourself. And at MLA, when we all were returning to the office, we asked people to think about it in this way. Think about your client and your duties to them. Think about your team and your duties to them, and then think about you. Client, team, you. That's the way you need to think about, and you need to communicate with each other. And also, I was going to say macaroni cheese. M&G in Stirling had nobody in the office on a Friday, and the chef does an amazing macaroni cheese. Oh, yeah. And that is, so it's stupid things like that gets people in, and they're all sitting around the table, oh, that's great macaroni cheese. So anyway, so there's soft things you can do as well.
Rob, just one thing I did want to add though is we talk about people going back to the office, but actually a lot of people have been recruited around the country who cannot get to the office. And that was deliberate to be able to give opportunities to people to work who aren't tied to that office location. So it is actually really difficult to give a sort of parity of experience of belonging and collective understanding when there's a group of people for whom it is extremely difficult for them to get to the office and where it has to be a really big thing to make the effort. So that is another issue, problem, challenge.
It's just something you need to think about,
Low utilisation of offices has always been a problem, though.
Yes, it has.
In specific sectors, in particular. So, working with one of the big five pre-COVID, they brought us in to attract people back into the office. Their younger staff in particular who were working across client sites weren't coming in, and that's when we were back to that thing about we need to create events and reasons for them to come to this specific office, because they were losing out on mentoring, they were losing out on brand loyalty. The whole thing was diluting, and they could see it in their engagement programs how they were starting to lose their younger staff to other big management companies. So I just wanted to put something in there to defend offices of the future as well. What I think is we got them the wrong size. That's the issue.
I hope you will agree there were some fascinating insights there. We've got 7 or 8 minutes left. I wanted to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions and engage with the panel, because I'm sure, as you know, it's a fascinating topic with lots of... there's a question here and a question over there.
That you mentioned about the team, because I'm constantly hearing all this about the employee saying, well, I don't like this, and what do they think, and what's the service and all. It's more than just the individual, and this especially now with senior managers, because during the COVID, we all lovely gardens, go back to work out in the garden, go and make your tea and come back. But it was the younger people who suffered the most. So it's not just about me and am I happy, is it good for me? Is the organisation, is it good for the organisation, is it good for everyone else? And I think that a lot of that is lost by saying, oh, somebody mightn't be too happy. Obviously, they want to treat them like adults. It's a blended working, it's a nice environment. But I think people have to realise it's not all about individuals. And if somebody who's going to a really nice environment and is working with a team, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, suddenly says, no, well, that's not for me. I mean, maybe that person isn't the right person for your company either. So we shouldn't be so frightened that somebody might go somewhere else, because maybe it's the right thing for them to do and for everyone to do. So maybe it is about us as against me all the time.
And there was a question just 2 or 3 up from there.
My name's Paul Haddon. I work for Visa, European Experience Director. I think it's very clear to say that none of us really have that definitive answer just yet. I'm 6 months into my tenure at this organisation, and I found it fascinating in a sense of understanding where we are headed as an organisation and the ever-evolving and changing messaging that's sort of coming down from senior leadership. But I think the Tuesday-Wednesday thing, again, has been the conundrum for us. It's a vicious circle where you can't get people in, but when they come in, they're not particularly happy with the fact that everything's under pressure, lifts, coffee queues, because everyone's then thrust into those environments over those couple of days. So I think one of the things we're not set for, and this is not a conversation for workplace, but this is an infrastructure around how do you get to the workplace. So, for example, travel to and from the workplace for me is the biggest friction point for anyone coming to an office space, and the cost associated with that now. Because if you imagine where you would have had a weekly, monthly, yearly ticket, you're now buying singular tickets for those that don't go in the office. I'm an advocate of being in the office and will be there every day because that's just generally, that suits me better. But I don't think the government and the way in which they're managing the rail as an example, where they're potentially offering discounted tickets, which really aren't offering a discount, it just doesn't encourage people. So the infrastructure beyond the workplace is just not set for the future, in my respect. Not that we can come to that, the answer here, but I think it's a much deeper rooted cultural issue, and travel's a massive part of that, in my opinion.
Yeah. From a statistical perspective, there are two things that you need to consider there. The first is that it's not the travel per se that is causing the imposition on the working day that's creating the anxiety. It's the quality of the experience that the employee has having invested in the travel. So what was a cost of living before the pandemic is now considered a cost of working, both from a time and a financial perspective. So if your workplace doesn't enable the employee to be better as an employee, to fulfill more of their obligations to you, having invested in that journey, then expect them to be disgruntled if you ask them to come in. If the space supports them brilliantly, if they have an amazing day at work, what we're calling purposeful presence, they're planning their day around a purpose. If those purposes are fulfilled, guess what? They report they're having an amazing experience, and they forget the cost of arriving there. So it is that equation between the cost and the duration, but also the quality of the experience that you offer them once they've invested.
Absolutely, thank you.
Can we answer the questions as well? I think that's a great.
I thought it was more of a point than a question.
I thought that's a great point, and I think there would be people who would be incentivised to come in on Monday and Friday if it was off-peak travel, and when they got to the office, they got their macaroni cheese or their free coffee or whatever. I think you could at least get people there. Then you've got to make sure once they're there, Tim, that it is the right experience.
I totally agree with government intervention, but the food in and of itself will not change the pattern. Right, so it's a motivation to trigger something, but you pretty quickly get fed up of different pasta sauces. It's like, there's only so many Margarita Mondays and Fajita Fridays you can have before the marketing team at the catering contractor run out of ideas. The other problem the catering contractors have got is you employers can't tell them how many people are going to be in the office. They can't fulfill their anti-food wastage obligations that your guys in procurement tied them to when they were appointed. So they've got their own problems to contend with as well.
In many respects, it's a vicious circle.
It is, yeah, totally.
And again, I don't think anyone's really got the answer yet.
No. Smart cleaning. Sensor-based smart cleaning. If you've got somewhere to put your money, put it there. That's all.
So you were talking, I think you touched on community, perhaps, working with offices on a kind of Friday and a Monday and being able to kind of do something different. In my mind, it's community. I'm not sure if that's what you were talking about. Part of me wonders, is this a kind of private sector issue, or is it something that government maybe need to be involved with because of the community elements that could perhaps, could the spaces be used slightly differently? If you could have a large office that perhaps on, say, the ground floor, the community could be involved. How is that going to happen? How is that going to be involved? Is it on the business?
I think the government's got a huge part to play and actually could lead the way in this. We've done work with local authorities in Scotland, and they have too many buildings, too far apart. So, there's lots there. Scottish Government and individual, and the Scottish Futures Trust actually are looking at how buildings can be shared and managed centrally across a number of different user groups. And it's not so much embryonic, there's lots of examples of it. So, and also thinking about this 20-minute neighbourhood, so you don't necessarily need to commute from Howick to your office in Newton St Boswell's. It takes you an hour and you're stuck behind sheep, and it's hard. What you can do is actually go to your local community centre and you can log in there. So actually I see more collaboration across different sectors of the government, and I think they could definitely lead the way.
I think, yes, I mean, I think, I thought the question might be more around sort of planning and so on, but in terms of use, I think that idea of making space available locally with like the government hubs and local hubs, so that people who are located elsewhere have somewhere close to go to when they need to be in an office or when they want to be in an office. So you could have this mix, so you're not just talking about someone's home and the main office, but you have these other alternatives. And it could be that, you know, the Friday, Monday thing could be a time when people went to one of these local places in much the way that you were talking about.
Yep. Almost like a library space, I guess.
That kind of thing, a drop-in type of thing.
Slightly a sort of devil's advocate perspective here. I wondered if I could challenge the assumption that we simply can't have offices sitting empty. We used to accept that they sat empty Saturday and Sunday. If it is the right thing for our teams to be spending time together in the middle of the week, why can't the offices be empty the other days? There is, of course, a sustainability argument, which I buy into. But we can do other things. We can close floors, we can mothball buildings for short term if we need to. It seems to me that this is driven by cost. And actually, I think we should see it as a cost of our teams being productive together when we need to be, rather than simply saying, let's spread demand because it saves us money.
Any join us now?
I think the point I was making, because I think I use that term sustainable, was about sustainability, it wasn't about cost. The notion of having buildings semi-alive 4 days a week, the heating and lighting that goes into that, to my mind, is not sustainable from a cost perspective.
I think if you're closing down parts of the building on Monday, Friday, then what remains open has to provide sufficient facilities and variety of facilities for the people who are in that day, because they deserve to have the proper experience, not some sort of diluted type of experience because a lot of facilities are closed. I think that's a real problem.
I think basic economics stand that theatres can't make that work for themselves, pubs can't make that work, restaurants can't, hotels can't. So I love the fact that you're a devil's advocate, but I can't see how, if there are numerous other business supply chains which are about delivering space for people to use for an outcome, that suddenly offices are going to come up with some revolutionary new economic model that justifies taking a headline rent on a space that you're only going to use for 2 days out of 7 in a calendar week. So
We're out of time, I'm afraid. So all that remains left to do is to say thank you, Nigel, Tim, Gillian, Bridget.